Hi. In this video, we're talking about the relationship between Christian deconversion and the rapture. This is switching sides. What relationship does the Christian doctrine of the rapture have to do with conversion studies? I'll get to that in a moment. First, let's talk about what the rapture is. So, for all of church history, they've held the general notion that the Jesus that was lifted up into heaven was eventually going to come back down from heaven and judge the earth and establish a reign over the earth and so forth. But in about the 19th century, certain church leaders, upon re-examining the text, decided that there was this separate event that would occur at some point, which they called the rapture. The rapture was this idea that all the Christians on earth would disappear, or perhaps more dramatically, physically rise up into the sky and go to heaven. And then at some point beyond that, at a second time, Jesus would come back down and reign over the earth and so forth. And so this was especially popularized in the church in about the 1970s, when certain speakers and writers began to talk and write about this idea of the rapture. One book that popularized this was the book The Late Great Planet Earth, which was very popular at the time it came out. But wait, there's a third factor. You've got this messianic return. You've got this period of time when all the Christians disappear. And then you've got a period of time where these apocalyptic plagues and disasters are poured out upon the earth. Literally, it shows pictures of angels pouring out bowls of tribulations to the earth within the book of Revelation. And during this period of time, the whole earth becomes sort of a miserable place to live. And so you've got three events. You've got the disappearance of all the Christians, you've got the return of the Messiah, and you've got this period of sort of miserable plagues poured out on the earth. And so with these three events, for most of the church period after they've become popularized, it's been a game of cups as to figuring out the order that they occur. The general notion accepted by most churches is that Christians are going to disappear, and then all the misery and suffering are going to happen during this plague period, and then the Messiah will return and rule over the earth and so forth. There are variations on that, but that tends to be the most popular model. So now that you have this idea that there's going to be this disappearance of the church members, Christians, and there's going to be this suffering period, and then there's going to be the return of Jesus, something occurs within the church that was a thing I was not expecting until I began studying deconversion. You see, in the Bible, there are scriptures, there are verses that could be and are sometimes taken as this notion that not everybody is going to be prepared and therefore raptured out when all the Christians disappear. There might be some people who are, quote, left behind. And so this idea is, if you happen to be one of these people who don't disappear from the earth prior to this miserable period of judgments and plagues, then you're going to have to go through this period. You're going to have to suffer along with the rest of the world. So it's a rather frightening idea. And given that this is an idea which is embraced by a large portion of the Christian population, it is something that appears within church teaching and preaching. Because, hey, you don't want anybody to go through the misery. This is something you want to warn people about. So this is a motivation for evangelism, but it is also something that makes it into Sunday sermons, because all the Christians care about each other in the church, and they don't want each other to have to go through these trials and plagues. They want everybody to come up in the rapture. And so, as this is preached, it becomes part of the zeitgeist, the mental idea and modeling that Christians have about the eventual end of the world. In fact, it became part of the popular idea within Christians in the 1990s when a series of novels was released, titled Left Behind. And these novels detail this sort of apocalyptic period where individuals who were not taken up in the rapture have to suffer through all of these judgments and these plagues that are poured out upon the earth, which is a great idea for fiction, but it's absolutely terrifying if you happen to believe that this is a real thing that's going to happen in the future. Now, as a deconversion researcher, I listen to a lot of unpleasant events that atheists tell about the periods of time when they were Christians. And I was surprised to discover a neurosis that I call Rapture Anxiety. Now, as the name might suggest, Rapture Anxiety is this neurotic fear that some people have of the rapture. Specifically, that they might be left behind during the rapture. I mean, if you think about it, that is a pretty terrifying prospect. That living within a Christian environment, this event happens, and suddenly all your friends and family disappear, and you're left alone in the world. It could happen any moment. Like losing your mother in a crowd, but you're guaranteed never to find her again. And then, bad as that is, the worst part is then you have to suffer through a world that's going to fall apart and be destroyed by a number of plagues. It's not a very exciting prospect. It's downright terrifying. Let's talk about the symptoms of rapture anxiety. So I find rapture anxiety mostly in children. Possibly teenagers, if you happen to be a teen in the 90s and read the Left Behind books, which were very popular at the time they came out. But the symptoms include an obsessive fear of being alone. Meaning that, of course, you don't want to be left alone in general. You don't want to be alone. That's the whole fear of the rapture occurring and you not being taken with it. It's this idea of being alone. But more than that, you don't want to be alone because you don't want to not know when everybody's taken away and just be wandering around wondering where everybody is. At least you want to see when that happens so you know what happened. So in general, it's a fear of being left alone for those two reasons. You don't want to be left alone. That's the whole reason you fear the rapture. But you also want to make sure that you know when it happened, in case you didn't get with it. So that's fear number one, a fear of being alone. People who have rapture anxiety try to keep family or friends within eye line at all times, and they get fairly freaked out when they happen to be alone and not within eye line of a family member or a friend. The second symptom is what I call compulsive rededication. You see, the reason you might not be taken in the rapture is if you might not be right with God. So, people who have rapture anxiety are afraid that they're just not quite making the cut. There might be something they need to do to be acceptable to God in order to be taken with the rapture. And so with compulsive rededication, they're constantly saying some kind of prayer or committing themselves to the Lord or possibly getting baptized again just to make sure that they're in with God. And, they fear every time they do something that might be a sin or just not right, that might get them out of favor with God so that they don't get taken up in the rapture. So it's this kind of constant questioning about when am I good enough? Or am I good enough? So those are the two major symptoms that you see in rapture anxiety. Fear of being alone and compulsive rededication, meaning you're constantly praying or confessing sins or getting baptized or in general fear of your worthiness. So how does this relate to deconversion? Well, it's what I would call a stressor. And a stressor is some kind of event or idea that increases the probability that you might deconvert, become an atheist. So, if you're constantly suffering this stress of believing that maybe you're not going to be taken away and you might have to suffer alone through this period of plagues and nastiness, then your Christian life might be just a little bit miserable, which means that the prospect of perhaps all of this being untrue is fairly attractive. So it increases the probability of deconversion only so much as it would be much more comfortable if all of this was untrue. The other thing is, I have only ever heard about rapture anxiety from deconverts, from atheists that used to be Christians. Is this a problem? Maybe or maybe not. You see, when you become an atheist, or when you become a Christian, whenever you change viewpoints, whenever you switch sides, your entire life prior to that event is reinterpreted through the lens of that event. So in the case of deconversion, the person who is now an atheist has to look back on their Christian experience and change their notions about what was happening at the time. So at some point, let's say they have sort of a spiritual experience or this profound religious experience. When they look back on that experience as an atheist, they have to come to a different conclusion about what was going on. So perhaps they were going through some kind of delusion at the time. Maybe that's what was going on. When you're a Christian, let's say you hear some kind of sermon or read some kind of book that seems really profound and speaks to you in some way. When you look back on that as an atheist, you have to change the profundity of that and think about it in the way that it might be now that you realize it's untrue. Perhaps it was being deceptive, deliberately or not. And so this is the difficulty that I have with rapture anxiety, is that I'm hearing about it from a person who is now an atheist. And the question is, how much of that was what they felt at the time, and how much of that is a reinterpretation of the event through the eye of an atheist? Perhaps it wasn't as traumatic then, but now it's being thought of as traumatic. And if it's being thought of as traumatic, it's traumatic. No matter how traumatic or not it was at the time, looking back on it and seeing something that was stressful means that at this moment you're traumatized. So in order to determine how rapture anxiety really looks, it would be best if I were to be able to talk to a child or a teenager who is going through rapture anxiety at that time. That's not to say that it's untrue. Perhaps it's exactly how they describe it as an atheist. But through a process that we call phenomenology, you really want to get an idea of exactly how it is during the period of time that the person is experiencing it. But there you go. The idea of the rapture, followed by this idea of tribulation, of misery and suffering, apparently can be pretty traumatic to the child that's going through it. So this is an interesting thing I've discovered through deconversion research. If you're watching this video and you've gone through this as well, leave some comments below so that I can read about them. I'd love to know more about this. And if you're a Christian and you think that I've somehow mischaracterized the idea of the rapture or something along that lines, feel free to comment. I'd love to be educated about it. Thank you for watching Switching Sides.